I was vacationing in Charleston, South Carolina, which turned out to be a truly historic city, and it's a wonderful place to visit for a vacation. But it also has its dark side. I wandered through its streets with its beautiful architecture and buildings. I wondered if these buildings could talk, what kind of interesting stories would they tell? I was making my way down one of the streets when I saw a beautiful church with a graveyard right next to it. I'd always been a fan of graveyards and said, what the heck, let's go in and check it out and take a short tour. At first, it's kind of strange to see a cemetery of this age next to a church in a bustling city. Most people are used to cemeteries which are off by themselves, but when the city was founded, the cemetery was on the edge of the town, and then the town slowly grew around it. I learned through a tour that the cemetery had been 5 or 6 times larger than it is today. So as I walked through the cemetery, I observed many tombstones dating well back into the early days of the United States. Sadly, some of them had carvings that had worn away over time from acid rain and were illegible. At one point I stopped and paused, and then I heard footsteps, but they sounded more like somebody jumping or skipping, like a child playing. And then I heard what sounded like 2 young girls laughing. I found that really strange for a cemetery. I spun around, but when I looked, I saw there was nobody else in the cemetery with me. Just me and a bunch of old grave markers. This sent a little chill down my spine. After a moment, I continued my tour of the cemetery, and I came to a small brick mausoleum. And for some reason, it gave me a strange feeling. And then I heard the laughter again. And this time, it froze my heart. This made me decide to get out of that place, so I quickly made my way out of the cemetery. Later that night, I signed up for a ghost tour of Charleston, and one of the stops would be that cemetery. I felt a little fear in my chest as we approached. I followed the group, but was a little worried that I would hear that laughter again. So I hung back a little. I decided to check out one of the gravestones, and then I heard the laughter again. I looked at the people in my group, and none of them seemed to hear it or respond to it. I got closer to the group, hoping that safety in numbers would come into play, and then our tour guide began to tell a horrific story. Back in the 1800s, there was a mania about the fear of being buried alive. Edgar Allan Poe had written a short story about it. And then she went on to tell the story of 2 young girls who had seemingly died from diphtheria. They had been placed in the mausoleum in that cemetery. After the burial, the father could not let go of the idea that maybe the girls had not been dead when they had been entombed in that mausoleum. And eventually, he went back to the cemetery. He opened the mausoleum only to find his daughters had gotten out of their coffins and were found laying against one of the walls of the brick mausoleum. They examined the wall and they found scratch marks all across it. And they also found the fingertips of the girls had been worn away because they had been frantically clawing at the brick wall, trying to get out of their tomb. That's where they died, trying to get free. This story would haunt me for many days. As our group left the cemetery, I looked back and I swear I saw the outline of the 2 little girls. Also, I thought I could hear them laughing. Or maybe it was crying. Those sounds continue to haunt me to this day. When you talk about historic buildings in Charleston, you can't get much more historic than the old Exchange Provost in the downtown area. This 3-story brown stucco building holds a lot of history. It is one of the 4 remaining buildings where the United States Constitution was ratified. I was on a business trip to Charleston and decided to take a break and wander the streets. And I came across a beautiful old building and read the plaque outside, which explains some of the history. At one point while reading this history, I thought I heard a strange scream or cry of pain. I glanced around, but I couldn't find a source for it. So I just blew it off as some kind of odd sound bouncing off buildings. After finishing the plaque, I decided to fork over the money to take a tour of the building. It was late in the day, and I was in the last group to take the tours. My tour would take me down to the basement in what they called the dungeon. This was the first jail in Charleston, and it had been known for holding various criminals and pirates, including Blackbeard and Stead Bonnet, who was known as the Gentleman Pirate. This dungeon, back in those days, was a truly awful place. Men were chained to the walls because it didn't have actual jail cells. And they were basically left there for days at a time with little to eat. And on occasion, flooding would occur because the dungeon was so close to the ocean. The basement would fill with water, and the jailers didn't want to go down there to risk their own safety, so they left the men to drown. All these stories creeped me out and sent a chill up my spine. Our tour ended, and the guide ushered people out towards the exit, but I stayed behind just a few moments to check out a few things on my own as he chatted with people. Then I heard a moaning sound. It seemed to be coming from everywhere. I spun around but couldn't locate a source. In the dungeon there were various mannequins to simulate some of the prisoners and other people from the city's history. And I could swear when I looked back at them, they had moved a little. I knew this was impossible, but I couldn't get it out of my mind that something had changed in their positions. And then I heard a moan and I looked away, but I saw nothing. When I turned back, it looked like the mannequins had moved even more. Outside, the sun was shining in and people would pass by the barred basement windows, causing the shadows of the walls to move. And I wasn't sure if this was what was causing the illusion, or were they really moving? All this sensory overload began to overwhelm me, and I spun around trying to find the source of the moaning. And then I saw a dark shape moving toward me, kind of shambling towards me. And it was moaning. And for a brief moment, I was locked in place, unable to move, as this strange shape got closer and closer. Finally, I heard our tour guide ask,
"Is there anybody left in there?"
And that seemed to shake me out of my stupor, and I bolted for the door. As I moved toward the exit, I could hear the sounds of dragging feet heading my way. I didn't waste any time and I got into the room outside the dungeon, and our tour guide said,
"You are as white as a sheet."
I stammered out that I was very hungry because I had had nothing to eat or drink for a while I was walking around the city. I just needed to get out of there and get some food in me. I quickly thanked him for the tour and climbed the stairs to get out of there. I got to the street level and out of the building. It took me a moment to normalize and get my emotions under control. I glanced back into one of the windows and I could swear there was a dark shape with glowing eyes looking back at me. Again, I was frozen. And then a car honk sounded, and that broke the spell. And when I looked back, there was no shape there in the window. I decided that my exploring for the day was done, and I got as far away from that building as I could. But the sound of those moans stayed in my ears. I'd only been living in Charleston for a few months, and I really didn't know a lot about the history, but I could see it all around me. When I had time off, I would explore, and one day I was walking by this beautiful white church in the center of the old downtown. It was St. Michael's Church, and reading up on it, I found that it was built in the 1750s, which makes it older than the United States. I walked around the building, and at the back I saw there was a cemetery. I stared at it through the fence when a blast of cold air hit me dead on, sending a chill through my body. For a few seconds, I thought I saw a shape in white among the tombstones, but it disappeared before I could really focus on it. And when it was gone, so was the cold air. I was a bit stunned because I was pretty sure that I'd seen a ghost, but I didn't really believe in them. This shook me to my core, and I stood there for a bit to regroup. Once I was in a better mental state, I made my way back towards the front of the church, thinking I could talk to somebody about what had happened and maybe get some information on the history of the church. The door was open, so I made my way inside, but the place was empty. I found the sanctuary very stunning with its wood and stained glass. It was very well preserved for being over 200 years old. I had barely entered the entry when I felt the same wave of cold hit me full on. This stopped me dead in my tracks. Then I saw a shape in white. It was a woman, and she hovered in the middle of the aisle, looking at me. She held her place for a moment and then drifted towards me. I was mesmerized and stood stock still, and this form closed in on me. Finally, I was able to break the spell, and I turned from the ghost and dashed out the door into the sunlight, where the world returned to normal, and I welcomed the heat of the day. I put out an arm to steady myself against the church, and an off-duty tour guide approached and asked,
"Are you okay? Did you see her?"
She went on to explain the legend of Harriet Mackey. Young Mackey had died on June the 4th, 1804, at the age of 16 or 17. She had donned her wedding dress and fell ill while walking down the aisle of the church. She collapsed a few feet short of the altar where she was supposed to be married. She ended up dying on that spot where she laid. Rumors spread quickly that she had been poisoned, as she was poised to inherit her father's vast estate on her marriage, though the property was to pass to the owner of a nearby plantation if she died beforehand. As her corpse lay in bed, still dressed in her wedding white, Charleston's elite paid their respects. I thanked my tour guide for their story, and they went on their way once they knew I was able to stand on my own. I drifted away from the building, and as I did, the bells began to ring. All I could think of was the wedding bells that poor Harriet never got to hear.